Right. Hey guys, this is take 4 for me on screen recording. I did the entire presentation all the way through once and no audio recorded. So hoping for the best the second time through or fourth time through. Okay, so I chose peer-mediated interventions for autism. The reason why I chose this topic was because I work as an early childhood special ed teacher in integrated preschool classrooms. And so we have in a handful of preschools kids with autism in the classroom. And I think the biggest misconception that I see is when we place kids with autism in the same room, people think they will just acquire social skills like their typical peers. And then as kids get older, as I'm supporting behavior plans later on down the road, I see that it's that lack of social skills that ultimately is excluding kids from their greater school communities. And so, as far as why these strategies are important, you know, a lot of times kids with autism either aren't interacting with their peers at all, or they try to interact, but they do it in ways that are socially unexpected or awkward. And so, one of the things that the National Standards Project really showed us in the report was that when we focus on peer-mediated interventions, we see an increase around learning readiness, communication, and interpersonal skills. More importantly, I think, was that when we focus on peer-mediated strategies, we see a decrease in restrictive, repetitive, non-functional behavior or interests and activities, which again is huge for our learners with autism in the classrooms. And so as far as like the review of what the NSP described, so age and skill level of peers are similar, activities are motivating, really focus on like teaching peers how to do that interaction. And then once training has occurred, we're allowing peers to practice in familiar settings. And then we're using kind of that concept of behavioral skills training with instructor feedback to facilitate those interactions. And then getting at multiple settings and peers to promote that generalization. Common peer training program names. So these are ones that we talked a lot about, so I won't go over them, but I just thought it was important to kind of include, again, this is another framework for what can be included. Yes, of course, they're evidence-based. That should not be a surprise to anyone listening to this, based on both the EI Colorado guidelines and the NSP. And so components for this literature review. Again, I really wanted the focus to be on inclusive preschools. In public schools, I tried to highlight a couple different areas or settings. Of course, all studies included typical peers. And like I mentioned, I wanted to focus on studies outside of ones that we already have looked at in class. And then, of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So I originally pulled 6 studies and then only ended up including, it might be 4 total in this. But there's so much out there. It makes me wish I just had more time to devote to reading. So the first one that I looked at was interventions that facilitate socialization. And so this wasn't so much a specific study as it was an overview, but I just felt like it lended nicely to, I don't know, building a better framework, I guess, even just for myself in what can constitute as a peer-mediated strategy. So it was written by Sally Rogers, who is kind of the brains behind Early Start Denver model. And because I like that model so much, I read through this article. And so the highlights were, that the idea being with peer-mediated interventions, we're really looking at highlighting and capitalizing on natural reinforcement. Most studies are either looking at peer initiation or peer responses. And then she looked at 3 different areas. I, of course, only highlighted preschool. So she looked at 2 different areas. I should actually say 4. There's 2 different slides. So the first one was parent-preschooler interaction. And the study that she reported on in this review focused on following a child's leads, and then it shows all the different increases in skills that were gained when the parents followed the child's lead. That second one is getting into more about just a general adult, so a classroom teacher, a caregiver, not necessarily the parent, and their use of pivotal response training. Another interesting one was visual cueing with a script fading procedure. And so basically what they did in this study that she just kind of touched on briefly was they taught kids with autism to go initiate an interaction with a adult, and then they would get reinforcement based on that initiation. So it was a very systematic way to build joint attention. They also looked at increasing interaction and responding to peers. So the kind of leads in her review there, she stated, were Strain, Odom, and Goldstein, just based on this review written in 2000. And so their focus, I do see with their idea of peers being taught to initiate play, to share, to give, praise and affection. I see some of that kind of carryover as I've read more and more studies. Another big carryover is that role playing with adults first and then transferring the skills. Looking at incidental teaching or natural environment teaching gets at the idea again that we want to use items in the environment that are naturally motivating. So toys, activities, going to a sensory room, a motor room, whatever is in the natural environment. And then it's really looking at utilizing concepts of prompting and shaping, really at that most basic level. And then, of course, they're all child initiated in that incidental teaching model. And then, again, a common thread I saw was that peers are reinforced for their efforts. Utilizing peers during snack time. So this was a study with a focus done in a Malaysia Montessori school. And so kind of things I pulled from that study where they created this framework for the study because they found that children with autism socialize with their peers only about 1.8% of observed intervals compared to same-age peers. And then also kids with autism are at a higher risk to be rejected among peers. And then, of course, being in the EI class, I appreciated, the research around stating those social trajectories and the importance of building some of these skills before the age of 6. The overview of the method, so it was in a Montessori preschool in Malaysia, done with 3 children and 9 typically developing peers. The focus was on snack time, and so they focused on reciprocal interaction for the 5 minutes before the food came. And so they had high treatment fidelity in IOA. They also had high social validity based on the ratings from those who participated. So they basically had 3 different groups with a target child, 3 peers, and a teacher in each group. They used a good friends board as that correspondence training. And so they looked at social initiation training, which they did by peers attending a peer training. And they basically set it up so that the puppets are essentially the children with autism, and the peers were taught to use gestures and language to prompt and elicit responses, taught to request and share food. And then they used this concept of point and talk that involved the Good Friends board. At the snack table, they had the Good Friends board present with a bunch of different visuals that were basically cueing the peers to engage in the behaviors they practiced. And so before snack time, peers were asked to state their target initiation. So who were they going to initiate with and what skill were they going to practice? And if they followed through with that, they received a stamp. Teachers were present to then prompt through those social interactions. As far as results, there was an increase in frequency of both social interactions and verbal interactions. So it went from, that low side of 0 to 10% in baseline, and then they saw an increase from there. And then they stated that these results are consistent with other findings. I found it interesting just in thinking about that social validity and the teacher buy-in component. Teachers stated that they likely wouldn't use the systematic prompting again, but they would use the point and talk and food sharing. In addition, participating teachers also saw increased social interactions. In addition to those increased social interactions, they saw the increase in typical peers' social competence, those formation of early friendships, and speech and language gains for target children. So I think that component is critical too in considering the use of peer-mediated strategies is the benefits that can exist for peers. The next one was speech-generating devices with peers. This was important to me just because of my experience working with young kids in preschool and the need to explore options beyond just PECs, especially in the age of technology and that availability and ease that can come with SGDs. And so in the framework for the study, they really were going at the idea that there are many opportunities within the preschool classroom to embed functional communication. In the past, naturalistic teaching strategies have been used with those devices. I think the big component that I've seen, so I appreciated they pointed it out, was teaching peers how to interact with kids who have speech generating devices. And then the idea that previous research indicates that when children learn to interact with their peers, they have a greater reduction in those core deficits, communication, joint engagement, and play skills, which I would say are definitely the three common themes I see in IEPs as far as needs identified. So overview of the method. So it was in an inclusive classroom, 3 hours per day, 4 days a week, which was typical for what we see in the Colorado preschools here. So they really looked at rates of communication and reciprocity and engagement from peers with autism. They measured through the use of a video camera and high treatment fidelity, high IOA, and I thought it was interesting social validity was not addressed, but this study did come out of a speech and language journal, so not a behavioral journal. I considered not including it, but I found a couple different ones on speech generating devices, and they both came out of speech and language journals. So based on all of the other criteria, the study met those main objectives. That was the only component missing. And so when we look at the overview of the study, baseline had 2 kids paired together. The device was present on the table next to them in play, but there was no prompting to use it or engage with it. And then peers in the second phase or in the intervention phase received training to be responsive and communicative play partners. So they used this idea called stay, play, talk. They broke it down into 3 steps. So play is share toys and take turns. Talk would be using the device, and then stay they got into with this book called More Ways to Be a Good Buddy. So it was kind of taught the back and forth communication skills, but the target that the intervention was looking at was helping peers to get their friend's attention, to hold an item, and to wait, as that idea to elicit communication from the child. And so then the adult was present to prompt communication using the least to most hierarchy, which I thought was interesting too, just because the idea with a lot of, if we're teaching a brand new skill, oftentimes I feel like that most to least hierarchy can be a little bit more effective, but they did see results with the intervention that they used. And so in the intervention phase, each child had an increase of interactions across all different targets, center, snack, and cause and effect toys. The biggest limitation I saw in this study was there was no maintenance phase. So you saw the baseline, you saw the intervention. There was definitely an increase in skills. But what I would be curious about then was removing that intervention, which at that point would really just be the adult prompting and the peer training, to see if those skills were generalized between both the peer and the target child. The final study is enhancing social skills training in kindergarten. So I know this is at kind of the far end of that early intervention window, but I do feel like it still capitalized, in that under 8 window that I really look at in my EI practice of birth to 8. And so the framework for this study is that they addressed that there are 3 different kinds of studies that often are involved in peer training for kids with autism. The first 3, all 3 can be effective. However, the second 2, so operant training and peer-initiated procedures, are more effective in teaching specific skills, where the first one, so proximity, is better with generalization, with the idea that it's a more loose training. And so with this study, they wanted to see if peer-initiated procedures were taught to a kindergarten class, if they would yield stronger results than proximity training. So basically, proximity training being what's happening in most classrooms, which is we place a student with autism in here with proximity to their peers, they'll learn social skills. What I liked about this was they used the reversal design, which I feel like we don't often see. Just because of the ethics of like removing a treatment, but because baseline was proximity training, which is what's currently existing, they were able to use that. And so they looked at, baseline is proximity. The intervention was measuring 4 different social skills. And so they pulled a group together of people in the school who could strongly identify what are the skills needed in kindergarten. And so they identified those 4 social skills listed. So asking for an object, responding, appropriately getting the attention of another person, waiting for a turn, looking at the direction of the other person who's speaking. And so they collected the data for 10 minutes a day, focused during center time, and focused on the target student. Of course, high treatment fidelity, IOA, and social validity. And so in the first phase, they used center time to teach all of the different peers about this concept of a buddy system. In the second phase, they then used the buddy system, and each day, all the kids in the class were assigned a different buddy. So a daily buddy, it changed every day. When it was buddy time, which was cued by the teacher, students checked the chart and found their buddy. All students were taught to stay with, play with, and talk to their buddy. And so what happened then is if students followed those things, they got their names put into a box, and teachers would reinforce following the stay, play, and talk by getting access to the treasure chest or prize. What I thought was cool about this was they mentioned that within the first 4 weeks, they discontinued the prize box just because kids were engaged and interested in buddy time without needing that extra reinforcement. So results with this one is that it showed the buddy program elicited more appropriate social skills than did the passive proximity approach. And so they did some great follow-up. So they had a maintenance phase where they removed, the adult prompting. But the cool thing was they did a follow-up even further than that with one of the 2 boys who participated in the study. And so in first grade, they checked those same 4 social skills and the rate that he was engaging with peers. And it was at the same rate as it was during the intervention phase of the buddy program. And so it really showed that this concept and what he was taught, he was able to generalize those skills, not just into a new setting, but across into a different school year. Again, that idea of teacher buy-in and that social validity concept, of all the studies I read, I do think that this one was probably the most feasible to grasp onto. And teachers stated in the report that they really liked the buddy system. It was easy to use, and they would definitely use it again. So my final thoughts, of the 6 that I reviewed, 4 that I included in this PowerPoint, the majority of studies included male participants. So I think it would be interesting to focus more on peer-mediated strategies, because it does get at that social interaction of girls. But of course, seeing more male participants is just common with a trend in autism. And then I am most interested in follow-up on the SGD, and I would actually love to try and implement the kindergarten buddy system, just because reading through the study, I felt like it was feasible. I'd also be curious if you could take that same concept and apply it to the preschool setting, just to really build that idea of peer mentorship and early friendships. So the last slide is just my references. So hopefully you guys learned something new. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen.